seat here.
Okay, I'm returning.
It's okay.
Hey.
Yep, you're live.
Okay. Alrighty. I'm still in Adam's microphone, so I'm doing kind of the cheesy holding on to it bit here. Thank you all for coming tonight on a nice Wednesday evening. Give a couple of shout outs. First to Slalom for providing this awesome space that we get to do this in. Adam and myself and Ricky work for Slalom, as do Nancy and Megan back there. If you have any questions, want to learn more, or just want to chat, you can always talk to us at any time. Or if you just want to ask, I like a beer, so you can always talk to me about beer. That's a very valid conversation point. So thank you for coming. So next month, we have Tim Hullerman, who is one of our solution owners that I myself work with, as does Ricky. And Tim is going to be talking about building bridges and understanding the roles that developers have in working with project management and Scrum Masters, which I know doesn't sound necessarily super exciting, but I will attest that it is a pivotal role. I think in today's day and age, what we've tried to focus on is the ability to cover a whole bunch of different topics. As a web developer or front-end developer, you run everything from design to projects to architecture to actual coding. Kind of understanding all of these flavors is something that we hope to bring to this meetup. And so we encourage you to attend and enjoy and learn a lot from the perspective that Tim brings, who is an awesome guy. And it will be a fantastic meetup. So there's my kind of long-winded sell on next month. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Adam. Oh, yes. So there is a sheet of paper, and I have...
It's also might be on the board there. I don't know if that's correct.
Uh,
I can verify that it is passed. Yes.
Okay, there you go. One last thing, actually, before I turn it over. So afterwards, questions are encouraged. Feel free to interrupt Adam. He won't bite. And, well, he might bite. But we'll be hanging around, and if you want to talk to us about the talk or anything else, feel free.
Excellent. Thank you, Sig. All right. Just give me 1 second to get this on. Okay. Oh, we can even just leave that right there. All right. Well, again, thank you all for coming to Denver Modern Web. This is going to be our 6th meetup, and I'm going to be doing a talk today on a primer on cloud with AWS. As Sig mentioned, I'm Adam Jacaruso, so just a quick little blurb about me. I'm a solution architect here at Slalom, focusing on front-end stack, but also dabble quite a bit up the chain throughout full-stack development, and been working a lot with AWS in the last year in order to kind of hone my chops a little bit and get a lot more knowledge. So again, as Sig mentioned, if you have any questions at any time, just raise your hand and I'll find you and we'll chat about some stuff. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to be doing a quick primer on serverless web applications. So we're going to start off by covering a little bit of the history of cloud and AWS and their journey to go from where they first started in 2006 to where we are now, just a light overview. From that point on, we're going to talk about getting actually set up in AWS, just kind of a few little things just to know, even if you've never created an AWS account before. So we're going to touch on a few of those little things there and a couple of gotchas along along the way. After that, we're going to be going into a live demo where we're going to be taking a static HTML file and hosting it up into S3. From there, we're going to be going into creating a table in Dynamo for a database, and then going from there and spinning up some Lambdas and API gateway. And we'll get into that in a little bit in order to make a RESTful call, so that way our static website can actually have a RESTful API baked inside of it that actually goes all the way out to Dynamo, fetches data, and comes all the way back to our front end. And all of that's going to be done inside of the cloud. So that's what we're going to do today. It sounds like a lot, but trust me, we're going to get through it. And I'm going to try to keep us to an hour. So great. So AWS, and what is cloud? So cloud is essentially what came from this idea that Amazon had way back in 2003. So 3 years before AWS was even founded, where a lot of their executive team kind of got together and they kind of saw a need that the internet needs an operating system. And that was their original thought behind what eventually became cloud infrastructure. The idea that you had to go out originally and have a whole system on-prem, you would have to go requisition servers and do all kinds of stuff to set them up. And then before your project could even get off the ground, you were a month in and thousands of dollars already in the red just to get your infrastructure set up for a company. So this made it for like startups and places that don't really have that kind of cash flow, even just to get set up, really difficult. And then how do you scale and all these things, and they went down kind of this rabbit hole of like, wow, there's so many things, all the inefficiencies of how we do our infrastructure for the web is just, it could be so much better. And so fast forward 3 years later, and all kinds of beta programs and all kinds of bits and pieces, they came up with the first little bits of what will now become AWS. They launched in 2006. They were the first to market with this type of technology. When originally they came to market, they had 3 unique services they brought to the table. One being S3, which we're going to actually talk about in this lecture, which we'll get into in a minute what S3 is. Next was SQS, which is a queuing service. And then lastly was EC2, which EC2, probably a number of you are probably familiar with if you have any kind of dabbled with AWS in a bit, essentially spinning up a virtual machine that you can kind of do whatever you want in. And we're going to be talking about Lambda in a little bit, and we're going to be talking about how Lambda has actually taken away a lot of stuff from EC2 because you don't need those containers anymore. And that'll actually be a part of what we talk about today. So let's see. So what you'll need to follow along. If you want to follow along, you can. Otherwise, this is being recorded, so you guys can follow along at home at your own pace. There's a link inside of our Meetup channel where you can go view it at your leisure later. So all you'll need is an AWS free tier account and your IDE of choice, which is pretty straightforward. So what do you get in the free tier? AWS gives you a ton of stuff in the free tier when you first sign up with an account. You'll get, these are some of the things that we're going to be using today. You'll get 5 gigabytes of storage in S3. You get 1 million Lambda calls per month. They give you a ton of stuff. Everything you need to be successful to kind of go in and get your, jump in, they have for you. And that's really nice because I know when I was starting out, I was kind of nervous, like, were they going to charge me a ton of money for getting a bunch of stuff spin up and doing all these things? Not really. For the first 12 months, most of what you would cover is going to be in the free tier unless you start doing some serious, serious stuff. So it's pretty safe to jump in. More often than not, they have a whole page of a list of things that are going to be a part of their free tier. Again, it does expire after 12 months, so even if you're looking just to kind of dabble, you can go spin up an account, and after 12 months you still just want to dabble, you can always just fire up another account and it'll be included again in the free tier. So kind of little bits to be aware of. And so those are those 2 parts that we're going to be using today. The other 2 are non-expiring offers. So AWS does have a number of things that they don't expire. You can get these things beyond your 12 months. The 2 things that we're going to be talking about today are going to be DynamoDB, which offers 25 gigabytes of storage, so it's a huge ton of space. And then API Gateway gives you 1 million API calls, essentially. And that's a lot. So everything we're going to be doing today is pretty cut and dry with all this stuff, so no worries about that if you're worried about anything there. So how do you sign up for an account? It's just the same thing as anything else. If you have an Amazon account already for personal use, so you just go on and buy stuff on Amazon, you're already set up actually with an account, and you could just add in your email, name, and address, a couple other little things here and there, and you're just good to go. So it's already tied actually to your Amazon account. and some of their feature sets actually hook up into Amazon products you've already purchased. So if you have an Amazon Dot, for example, and you bought it through your account and all of that, a lot of that information is actually pre-baked into your AWS account, and they actually have those devices already linked and ready for you to use inside of their Poly service, which is what they use for text-to-speech. So there's a lot of little goodies about that that are kind of baked in, and we won't necessarily be talking about that today, but just food for thought. So some of the things to note when you are setting up your account, they do require a credit card. So you're going to be prompted with this field, and you're definitely going to have to put one in, because even though you're in the free tier, they won't charge you, but they need a card on file. So something to be aware of. And the last bit is they're going to give you two-factor authentication. And you're going to have to set that up through your phone. You're going to have a phone that you can connect to and do that level of connection, because that's basically how they make sure that you're you. And if you ever were to lose your phone or somehow get rid of that, it actually can be pretty cumbersome to get it back. So just kind of be aware of that when you're setting up your account, that QR code and taking the snapshot and making sure that you have it all baked in and having backups of it is so important, because I know of even some major companies and clients that we've worked with here where you kind of take the code and all that and you lock it away in a vault and then you have no one ever use it again, because you go and you have that account make another admin account, and then that's the account you do everything with, and you do nothing with the root privilege account. But today we'll be doing everything with the root privilege account, because we're just getting started, and it's okay to do that, and we'll just learn. All right, so with all of that, we are gonna just dive right in. Any questions so far on any of that stuff? Okay, all right then. I think it's this one. All right. So I've already logged into my account. We're already signed in. And the first thing that you're going to see inside of here is going to be the AWS console. And you can see in here, they have a ton of offerings. Everything in here is called, every one of these is an AWS service. Again, they started with 3 in 2006. So here we are 12 years later, and they've got a lot more than 3. So today we're going to be focusing on 5. The 5 that we're going to focus on, as I mentioned before, are going to be API Gateway, DynamoDB, IAM, Lambda, and S3. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is S3. And S3 is essentially going to be a place to store all kinds of files. And for our purposes, it's going to host our actual HTML file to get started. So let's start with our IDE. I am a fan of Visual Studio Code, so we'll start here. And I'm just going to make just a really simple index.html file. And we'll be using this, and we're going to host it up in S3. So we'll go through here. We'll start with our basics. Oops. And we'll do H1. We are Denver Modern Web. And I'll just save out that file. And here we go. Cool. So in S3, the way that they keep all their data is they keep buckets. And buckets basically, you can think of it like a folder system. Under the hood, it is not a folder system. If you have questions on that, you can always come and reach me afterwards. But for the purposes of basic talk, essentially it's going to create a place where you can create folders. Think of it like a drive where you can store files. So for this, we're going to create a new bucket. And essentially, this bucket is going to represent our actual domain that we're going to make. When we're going through all of this, it's going to create an S3 URL that you'll be able to link to statically, and we'll get to that in a moment. But something to note, if you have a domain that you want to host on S3, you have to make, for the DNS routing to work properly, the bucket name has to be the same name as your domain. So you can see here I have Adam Jacaruso because I have adamjacaruso.com. So by having this bucket, I can ensure that I can always map my domain that I have registered to this bucket. If you don't have that, just some food for thought, like make sure that you go register your bucket with whatever website name you want, because don't let somebody else do it. Because otherwise you won't be able to host your files in S3 statically. So it's just something to be aware of. So for this purposes, I'm going to make Denver Modern Web our bucket name. We'll go next. Yep, region North Virginia. Yep, that's fine. We don't have anything special to configure here for our bucket. And set permissions. Since our bucket's going to contain our static HTML file, we're going to go into here for their permissions. Normally you'll make a bucket and you would want some kind of private access on it. Like let's say you have some secure files for your company or something to that effect. You would want this enabled. But since we're going to be hosting some static assets to be served up as an HTML web page, we're definitely going to want it to be public because we want people to read our website and actually go to it. So that would be great. So we're just going to click next here. And then this is going to be kind of a readout of everything that we just did. And we're going to create the bucket. So it spins up right here. We can see that Amazon tells us that it's public. We're not going to get into too much of regions, but essentially almost everything that you do in AWS is going to have regions associated with it. For all of this, we're going to do US East. There's a number of different ones. There's a few that are actually closer to Denver, but all the latest and greatest AWS stuff is typically done and delivered from a service perspective to US East first. So just something to be aware of, and we're going to make sure that we're always in US East. So if I ever deviate, if any of you are AWS folks in the room and you see that all of a sudden I'm not in the right zone, let me know, please. Because some. Sure.
Why that would be? Because obviously there's a lot of tech hubs on the West Coast.
I'm sorry?
Do you know why it would be more, why they would be releasing stuff more on the East Coast versus the West Coast? Because there's a heck of a lot more tech on the West Coast.
Originally, that's just where they decided to keep a lot of it. It was like kind of the first, and that's just where they just decided to kind of put it all. I don't actually know the reason, like the history behind why it's US East 1 is where they deliver everything first. It's just kind of what Amazon has decided. No. Could be. I'm sure there is some sort of history there. I just don't know it. I just know that if you want the latest and greatest, US East 1, that's where you go. Like, so a lot of the newer stuff, like a lot of the Internet of Things and like even Poly and some of that stuff that's been introduced more recently. I don't know if it's migrated to all the other regions yet, but that's where it starts first. If anything's brand new, that's where it lives. So that's where a lot of it's kind of nice when you're learning a lot of these things. If you kind of set that as kind of the default region that you go to all the time, you're not going to go wrong because it's going to have all the services available to you. You're not going to run into, oh, look, I set up all my infrastructure in London, but then Poly is only available in this region, and then it kind of gets a little funky. So making sure that you have it all set up in the same region kind of helps you with all like latency and all the times for getting things done. So, any other questions so far? And do the same thing, interrupt me. You can do that too. You don't have to just raise your hand. I don't mind. All right. So now we have this this bucket. So click into it. And we are just going to add a file. And it's very easy. You just go in, you just add files. And we'll just grab our index.html file. Next, and just upload. And there we are. It's up in S3. But right now, it's still just a bucket. It's just a folder system retrieving assets. It's not actually doing much. Next up, we're going to be going over to here, and we're going to be setting this as a static website. And we're going to use this bucket for hosting. We're just going to do our index.html, because that's what we put in there. I don't have an error.html. This is me. So for right now, in this purposes, you could set up an error.html. Basically, if anything kind of goes wrong in the static process or you don't have it displaying right, this error, Amazon just knows to serve up this page instead. So for right now, we're just going to do index.html. And it gives us, even in there, it gives us our nice URL. And if we copy that, we go over to here. Whoops, did I not copy? Oh, that's why. There we go. Doesn't work. We're forbidden. So there's still one more step that we have to do, even though we made the bucket public and all that stuff. And that is going to be in this folder, or sorry, this tab right here called permissions. And so we're going to go into bucket policy, and we have to let AWS know that we want anybody to go in and view any asset inside of here. Even though we already made it public, you still have to go through this step as a policy. So I'm going to go in and quickly grab the policy I made, which is right here, just for ease of use. And basically all this is saying is this is going to be an effect of allow. So we're going to allow everybody the action of get stuff out of S3, and it's going to be the resource of our bucket, modern web, and then just anything inside of modern web. So here you can actually get pretty detailed with your permissions. For the purposes of a static website and hosting, this could be good if you wanted to actually have things, only certain level of users come in to view your website. They would have to have AWS access and go through. You can set up all kinds of neat little things in here if you wanted to do more to protect your website. However, for us, we just want everybody to come view our website. So that's what we're going to do.
Would this replace the role of like a traditional htaccess file?
No, not necessarily. No, this is more so for like. To be honest, with static websites, you probably pretty much always want to do this. There are cases where you don't want to, but yeah, you can still even do a lot of that stuff under the hood. But you wouldn't necessarily do it here. If you want to talk about that stuff, you can come talk to me afterwards. I just don't want to get too into the weeds on that because that could take a little while. No, you're fine. So we'll save that. Yep, and you can see this bucket has public access. So now if we go back over here, we can see Denver Modern Web. So now we have our code that we just made hosted statically inside of here. So if you're working on a front-end project and it's like a React project or a Angular project, you're going to just take whatever comes out of after you build and whatever you build to your dist folder, you can just put it into an S3 bucket, and as long as you point it to the right index file, which will probably be index.html, it'll serve it up in here, and you'll have everything, your front-end web application, just running in AWS. And like I said before, it's going to be whatever, the URL is a little much because we don't have it associated with we don't have proper DNS hosting. But for right now, it's always going to be the bucket name, then S3, website, then whatever the region is, .amazonaws.com. So you can pretty much go to any, if you know what the bucket name is and you know where it's hosted, you can kind of reverse engineer the URL if you wanted to, because they're all the same. All right. So that got us to the point where we now have our website hosted in S3, which is awesome. So the next step is we want to add a RESTful call to Denver Modern Web. We want to be able to get the hosts of Denver Modern Web to appear on the page, at least our names anyway. I don't have really slick pictures of ourselves or anything like that. So we're just going to settle for names for now. So how do I make a RESTful call? And so that's going to be our next part. So we're going to go back into the console here, and we are going to first use DynamoDB. So DynamoDB, if you're familiar with NoSQL databases, so MongoDB, stuff like that, that's out there right now in the community, this is what that is. This is Amazon's version of that. So it's pretty easy to get started in here. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge. If you just have some kind of basic database knowledge or even some SQL knowledge, this isn't too different from that to get set up. So I'm not going to go into kind of the best practices of setting up your database, but at the same time, we are going to go in and at least create a table for this data. So we're going to create a new table. I am in, just double check. Yep, still in Virginia. So for some reason, every once in a while, I'll click something or my history will have it as a different region that it changes. So I try to remember. So we're going to make a table, and it's going to be called hosts. And we're going to make a primary key called host name. And all this means is that we have a table, and then we're going to have something inside the table called host names. And then we're going to associate data with those host names inside of our table. So that's all we need to get started. We can just hit create here. So this takes a moment sometimes for AWS to spin stuff up. And now we have it. So host exists. So let's go add some items. So now, right now, we can see that we have nothing in our table right now. So let's go and create an item. So already it pre-populates with host name. This is also where you can start building out your JSON structure for all the different stuff that you might want to put in here. For right now, we're just going to have the one field because it keeps things nice and simple. So we'll put in Adam as one of the hosts of Denver Modern Web. We'll create another item, and we'll do Ricky. We'll create another item, and we'll have Sig. Sig gets to be last because, I know, I'm sorry. So at this point now we actually have all our items in our table. We're ready to go. We don't have to do anything else here, but I want to show you kind of one last thing while we are here. There are two ways to essentially access your data inside of the DynamoDB database. Essentially right here you can see scan and query. So today, for when we're going to be writing this request, we're going to be using scan. Scan essentially goes out and gets everything inside of your database table and returns it to you and then filters on it. So the way that you would do things inside of here is if you just ran this right now, it would just come up back with everything. But you can add attributes to filter by data. So it could be host name, and we'll have a string equals Adam, and you can do a start search, and you'll see that only Adam comes back. So this lets you kind of play around a little bit with the data itself and not have to like actually do things in code and try it. This is actually kind of a nice UI tool to go in and figure that stuff out. So we are going to be using scan because the service that we're going to write is essentially going to go get all the hosts. So we actually want it to dump everything to us, and we're not going to be filtering. Scan is typically not something you default to. Normally you'll default to query, which query does a lot of the same functionality. And if I remove this filter, it must use the partition key, and it must be equal to something. So we would have to set that to Atom. It can't figure it out otherwise. You have to have something to be queried on for that partition key for host name in this example. So that doesn't necessarily suit our needs for this, but when you're querying the database saying, I just want all users with like the name Adam, like that, this would be more of an appropriate thing because it's less intensive because you're not pulling back all the records from your database like you would with scan, because scan is just going to filter everything based on what you tell it to go grab. What's up?
Is there pagination at this level, or is that?
I'm sorry?
Is there pagination of results at this level, or is that?
What do you mean by pagination of results?
Give me all, let's say we have 3,000 atoms, chunk them out 30 at a time.
Yes, it comes back. I think it's, there are limits and you can set those inside of scan. You would still want to do query for that, and you can set all those limitations. We're actually going to be in the example of making sure that we only return 3. So we'll be going over that in a minute when we're using scan. So you can kind of build out a lot of that stuff in here. We're not going to get to that level of depth. If you have questions on how to do it, though, I can absolutely answer that. I just don't want to bog too much down in the nitty gritty. So, all right. So yeah, so we have query and scan. Like I said, we'll be using scan, returns the whole database, so we'll be good to go. Thank you, Train. All right, so we can close out of this. Everything in here is already set. No need to save anything. Just already has it. It's going to remember. So the next thing, so we have our data and we have our website. So now we need to connect those two things together. And the way that we're going to do that is through API Gateway and Lambda. But before we do that, there's something that we need to talk about, and that's going to be IAM. Now, IAM is going to be, by default, everything inside of AWS is locked down. Services can't talk to any other service by default. Users can't talk to invoke any kind of systems. Everything is locked down by default, and you are granting permissions to either users, groups, or roles in order to actually determine what level of access they can have to what things. So for us, in this case, we need API Gateway to be able to talk to Lambda, and Lambda to be able to talk to Dynamo. And for all of that, we need to set up a couple of rules. So the one that we're going to do first is we're going to set up something so that way our Lambda function, which I'll get to what that is specifically in a minute, will be able to talk to all the data that we just made. So let's set up that policy. So when you go into policies, you can see all kinds of stuff that's in here. And there are all kinds of policies with all kinds of mismatch, and that'll come in time. Don't be overwhelmed by this list. The one thing that I will say is a lot of people will, if you give anyone this administrator access, they'll be able to do anything. They'll be able to talk to any service. They can spin up 1 million EC2 instances for you that costs like a ton of money a minute, or per hour, I should say, to use. And so just be a little wary of administrator access to things. Typically, you want to do least privilege and all that kind of stuff in order to keep all your data and all the things that you can spin up pretty safe. So we are, though, going to create a very simple policy. And this policy is going to be something that we have to define what it wants access to. So in our case, we want this policy to be access to Dynamo. So we're going to find our service of DynamoDB. And then actions. We're going to want the scan action. So if you look at the Dynamo, essentially like SDK, or AWS SDK, this is essentially saying you can access the Dynamo services, and inside of the Dynamo service, you can access this specific function. Did I see a? Okay, I thought I saw a hand for a second. And so we're going to select scan here, and now we're all good. So we'll be able to scan it. It won't have access to query because we're not going to select it, or anything else that might be inside of there. So for right now, we're just going to do scan. Next up is resources. For right now, we're just going to select all resources, because you could create a policy that basically says any Lambda can talk to anything that's hosted in Dynamo. For right now, we're just going to say, and that's pretty much what we're going to say. We're going to say that whatever Lambda is going to take this in, it can, or whatever I should say, not even Lambda yet. Whatever invokes this, has this policy, can go out and it can go and scan anything in Dynamo. So we're just going to select all resources. You could get very specific in here and make it so that this policy can only access this one table. and you can get very granular with how you do everything. But for right now, we're just going to do all resources, so we can access essentially any table that's inside a Dynamo, and we can scan it. So at the end, we're going to hit review policy, and we're just going to name it. And what did I call this? Trying to remember. Oh yeah, that's right. We'll call it Lambda scan Dynamo DB. You know what? We don't even need the Lambda because we haven't specified it. So let's just say scan Dynamo DB. That's all this is doing. We're allowing scan on Dynamo DB. That's it for all tables. And you can just, this will allow a scan of Dynamo DB. I always like putting in the descriptions because you always forget later on what you did. Great, and this is just a quick summary of what we did. Just got the one thing, and we're going to create that policy. So now it's in our gigantic list of policies. So if I type in scan here, there it is. And that wouldn't have been there before because we just created it. So right now, we're going to go into roles. And right now, I have no roles defined. So we're going to create one. And essentially, a role, it allows either a person or a service the ability to have an identity, to have a role associated, a policy associated with them, or multiple policies associated with them. So what we're going to need a role for is Lambda, because that's what we're going to be using in a moment. And we will be going next. And then now we're back at our permissions. So not only could we give it scan, but we could also give it all kinds of stuff. We can give it administrator access to do all kinds of nut stuff. But for right now, we just want scan. And you might add a lot of things in here there's stuff for CloudWatch and some other things for analytics that you could add, but for our purposes, we're just going to use scan. So we're going to review that. And now, oh yeah, I already had it from earlier. Thanks, Google. And so I'm going to call it Lambda scan DynamoDB and allows Lambda to call functions on your behalf. That seems fine enough. So we're going to go to create role. That's going to create. That's going to create. And there we go. We have our role defined. And that's kind of how IAM works. Are there any questions on IAM? I know I'm going through this maybe a little too quick and maybe glossing over a few things. So if you guys do have questions, feel free to ask. Yep.
Would it be a good time to go over what the differences between policy role and user?
Sure, we can talk about that. So roles are essentially going to be something that you're going to assign. So a role might be like, in this case, it's being able to scan Lambda. We called it Lambda scan DynamoDB, but it could just be called, it could even be called scan DynamoDB even as a role because that's the only thing we associated with it. Because when you were in roles, you had the option to assign all kinds of policies to and all kinds of level of access. We know this is just going to be for Lambda, so I just called it that. Users are more users that are actually in the system, and you can actually add in users. I actually have a couple here created from a couple days ago that I haven't blown out yet. But yeah, you can create users, and then you can assign them roles. So I might create a user that goes, and I might say, I want SIG to be a user in my system. So you would click here, add user. I'm not going to go through the whole process right now. And if you want to ask me more detail, we can talk later. But at a high level, you would add user. You can even set a password for him and have him then click a box that says allow him to go in and remap his password. And then once you've created that user, it'll prompt you for what roles you want to assign directly to him. So we can even give him this role that says you're allowed to scan DynamoDB. And that would be the only thing he could actually do in the system. Or we could have given him admin access, and then he has access to literally anything. And he can spin up EC2 instances, create those S3 buckets that we saw before. Because right now, if I gave SIG just the scan Dynamo role, he couldn't actually create buckets because that's not the thing that we gave him the ability to do. And so that's essentially what users are. And groups are just collections of users that have a role assigned to them. So you can say, I can make a bunch of folks in the system, give them no access whatsoever, but then start assigning them to a group that might have access to create S3 buckets. Then every user in that group has the ability to create S3 buckets because the role is assigned to the group, but as an individual user, if they were ever removed from that group, then they wouldn't have that access anymore. Good. Thumbs up. Does it answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, like I said, there is so much in AWS, and we only have about an hour or so to kind of get through it all. And I've only got, have 25 minutes left, so I'm trying to be good. But there is a ton here, and if you, yeah, well, thanks, Sig. Yeah, right. But if you do want to learn more about this, I always recommend that. I think everyone probably in here, if you are a developer, the best thing to go do is look into the AWS Developer Cert. There's a lot of great information. Udemy has a great course that is ultimately put out by A Cloud Guru. It costs like $12 on Udemy. Go get that course. Go through everything. You'll be able to do all the things that I'm doing and more, and it's about 18 hours worth of material. But at the end of it, you will know so much about AWS and be really confident in order to go kind of do whatever you need to do. And that's a great follow-up. If this interests you, all of the things we're talking about to get this working interests you, or Poly, or any of the things that I've kind of hinted at, go take that course. It'll do a world of good for you if you're interested. So, all right. So, any other questions on IAM and what it does and why it's important? Okay. All right. So now we get to actually talk about Lambda. And I probably should have talked, in retrospect, I probably should have talked a little bit about Lambda at the beginning, but I skipped over it in my notes by accident. So we're going to talk about it now. As it says right here, Lambda allows you to run code without having it tied to a server. So essentially, the way that it works is it allows you to go in and run stuff in Go, Node, Python, a bunch of other languages that we'll look at in a second. Basically allows you to go in, interact with the AWS SDK, or whatever you might want to put inside of it to go essentially run. It's just one thing that goes out, just one set of logic that goes out and does one task, and that through some level of code. In this case, we're going to have API gateway, which is essentially a RESTful call, which will basically, when we make a RESTful call, it goes through API gateway, like how you would make just a typical get, like get host is what we're going to call it in a second. From there, it says, okay, when get host is called, go run this Lambda to go fetch me the data from the database. And it allows to kind of be that middleman that says, okay, all my Lambda does is when I call it, it goes out and it just grabs the data out of Dynamo and returns it. And that's a very, very simple call that we're about to make. And it should be pretty easy, but I've seen Lambdas get pretty big. It's kind of, think of it, it's kind of like your constructor in a lot of ways, where you can just have all kinds of, I'm sure everyone has been here where you've been on something and everyone just overloads main, for example, and you're just like, oh wow, there's a lot of stuff going on in there. Try to break it up if you can. It can be very easy and a pitfall to kind of load everything up into one big Lambda, but then it takes forever to run. Typically, you want lots of lightweight Lambdas that kick off even other Lambdas. So you can even have a Lambda that does something that tells another Lambda to go do something that tells it to do, and you can kind of get pretty crazy with how you chain them together. So those are all kind of little bits of food for thought when you're architecting an application. And Lambda's only been around for about a year now, a little over a year. More than that, maybe 2 years, I can't quite remember. But this has pretty much revolutionized, I think, a lot of the way that we look at what can be done in the cloud. Because before, a lot of times, you would have to go in and spin up a whole virtual machine in order to just go in and run your little snippet, and that's all it kind of did. Or it would pull off like an SQS stack or something like that in order to go run some command. And this is way less expensive than that. Like these things are a fraction of the cost of what you would need to go and spin up an actual EC2 instance. And if you're curious of like how that works under the hood, happy to explain to you afterwards. Right now, that's a little bit out of scope for what we're doing. So, but let's get in there. Let's just start playing around. So when you come in here, you'll go to create a function. There's some blueprints and serverless application repository. I would recommend don't even bother with a lot of that stuff. It's best just to kind of write a lot of this stuff from scratch or kind of figure it out yourself. These things can kind of be helpful in some ways, but a lot of times I find that they're pretty cumbersome. But they can sometimes give you a hint of what other people are doing to solve problems. So be aware that they exist. But for our purposes, we're not going to do that. We're just going to go in and get this set up. All right, so we are going to call this get hosts because that's what we're going to do. We're going to get hosts out of our Dynamo database. And this is where that role comes into play. So we're going to call it scan. That is what I called it, right? Yeah. So we'll go lambda scan DynamoDB. So now this lambda. Sure. Oh, yeah. There's a ton of things in here, like I mentioned. I've heard good things, actually, about the latest one of Core. This actually used to be pretty bad from beforehand when you were looking at some of the older versions, in case any of you are .NET folks. I've heard good things about it, although I haven't run it myself.
Benchmarks I saw are done
Does it?
runtime.
Which one? I'm sorry.
Just like the general .NET Core. I mean, it's probably the latest, but yeah.
Yeah, the latest one is really good.
If you really care about raw execution, it's blows everything out of the water.
Yeah, but you have a lot of things to pick from in here, which is great. For our purposes, we're going to kind of stick in that front-end world, so we're going to at least use Node, so we're familiar with some JavaScript, but be aware there's lots of stuff that you can use in there, and they're only kind of growing. That list has even grown quite a bit, even since I first started, and even now they're adding multiple levels of Node and Python and other stuff, so it's kind of nice to be aware of what's available to you. So, great.
So one thing
Yeah.
I'm wondering about, though, is like under role, there's like usually like a Lambda basic execution. Oh, no, okay.
You have to create it before.
You had to create it. So you had to create, I had to create this role, so you can choose,
It gets created for you.
yeah, because you can create some templates and stuff in here, and it kind of like, it's best, I find, just to go, in AWS world, a lot of times they'll offer you the ability to create or do something with a service that isn't the service dashboard you're in. We're actually going to see that in a moment. We're at the very bottom of our Lambda. It's like kind of like that Clippy. So I hear you want to use API Gateway to connect your Lambda function, and it's like, yeah, I'll do that actually in API Gateway. Thank you very much. But I wish kind of there was a little Clippy.
Because DynamoDB, you just gave us some permissions to DynamoDB. Particular thing.
I created a permission that said this permission is going to allow whoever has this permission in the ability to scan any Dynamo table.
Okay.
So that's the permission I created.
So
Then,
something like especially into Lambda, we say, no, this guy's allowed to do.
So-
There's always permissions off, like for things you might want to do.
permissions off.
I didn't finish the thought.
Okay.
What I'm wondering is there a permission that says you actually have to have permission to run a Lambda?
Permission to run a Lambda. So API, we're going to have to allow API Gateway the ability to access Lambda. So yeah, so you're jumping ahead a little bit. And so like, and I think I hinted at it when we were talking about it, where I said, well, ultimately we're going to need to set some permissions for both Lambda and API Gateway so it can call Lambda. And there's no permissions to call API Gateway because it's a gateway that's open to everyone for RESTful calls and stuff like that. And you could set permissions actually, but yep. So this is specifically allowing our Lambda to scan Dynamo. And like I said, this role could have been called scan Dynamo DB, but it was specific to Lambda when we created the role, so that's what we're going with. So we can create function. And then now we're kind of in the actual guts of how we actually create something. So it already knows by default that we've already given it roles and permissions to access the service of Dynamo. So it kind of goes in and already says, we know what you're trying to access because you gave us a role that had a service of DynamoDB. So cool, we're already going to give that for you. And it's like, thanks a lot. And so the other thing we're going to set up here is the entry point. And so I'm going to give it this API gateway. And right now it's going to say configuration required. And so if you go, because right now it's going to come in through API gateway, it's going to run this Lambda, and it's going to go back to Dynamo, then it'll come back to get host, and then it'll come back to API gateway. And that'll be the Lambda that we're hooking together. It's kind of the guts of how our code is talking to each other from the different services. And you can even see down here that it'll try to be like, hey, it sounds like you want to create a new API. And I go, no, thank you. So I can cancel. And so for right now, we'll come back and we'll add that in a minute. And here we are. So this is what's going to execute when this happens. So right now, by default, all it's going to do is just going to have a little callback that just says, context done, hello from Lambda. And so we can go right up here, and we can test. And we'll just do test. Since this is just going to be, there are no parameters to give it, we can just get rid of that. And we can hit create. And then when you hit test, you can see that it says hello from Lambda. And so right now, all it's doing is executing some code. And this context.done is just letting us know that it's done, and it's going to print that out to the screen. So we are going to get kind of in there, and we want to do a lot more than this. So let's actually write how we're going to talk to Dynamo. So the first thing that you're going to do, you're going to make a constant, and we'll call it AWS, and we'll call require AWS SDK. So you'll notice that if you're traditionally from the JavaScript world, like you would have to have this SDK actually live somewhere and actually reference it like where does it live? It's not over on the left here. That's basically because AWF under the hood just kind of gives it to you for free because, hey, you're in AWS, you're running a Lambda, you probably need access to this SDK. So it'll kind of give that for you out of the box. So you don't really have to worry about that. All right. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create an instance of Dynamo. Client equals new AWS dot db dot document client, and then we have to give it a region for where we're actually going to go look. So we'll do read. Whoops. And we set it in US East 1. So that'll go out and that'll actually set this object in order to go get all the tables that we have in there. So the next thing that we're going to do is let's get rid of this to-do implement because I am going to implement something. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually we're going to create the properties for our scan that we're about to run because we want to be able to set, I forgot who asked the question, but you want to be able to set some limits on what you're going to scan and retrieve. So we're going to go scanning params. We're going to create this nice little JSON object and we'll say table name because we want to tell it what table to actually go grab. And we called it hosts, and we're going to limit it, to 3. So that'll say it's going to go grab stuff out of the hosts, and it's going to limit that to 3 when it comes back to us. And it's just going to do a scan, so it'll return everything, and it'll give us a limit of 3 hosts when it comes back with the scan. So next up, so now that we have our parameters, let's actually make the call. That sounds like a good idea, right? So we'll do .client, which is what we established was was DynamoDB. Excuse me. We're going to do a scan. We'll use scanning params, function, our error state, and our data that comes back. Chuck that down there. Because we want to be good programmers and have our error handling logic, we'll do an error if an else, and we're going to do a callback. We're going to do error, and error. Did I do that? Yeah, and then callback. And data to return our data. Great. Callback is not defined. 1 second. Oh, I know what I missed because I didn't do it here. Because it wasn't calling back anything before. It was just saying this is what it is and wasn't actually going anywhere and invoking any kind of callback functions. So we actually had to add it to the export handler. So we're all ready to go. So right now we have our params and then we have our function that's just going to go out and it's going to scan using our parameters, which essentially is going to go out into hosts and it's going to go look for it'll just return what's in there, which is going to include our host names. You can get way more specific. Like I said, in a scan, you can add all kinds of filters and all kinds of things in order to reduce your data set down. So if we go out and we'll save this, we can run the same test that we did before because there's no input of any kind, so it'll still go. We can run test. If we scroll up to the top, we can see that's our stuff from Dynamo. There's me, there's Sig, and there's Ricky. And those are the 3 things that we put into Dynamo. And we're good. So at this point, we've got our service. We have Lambda going out, fetching our data, and now we're able to hook it up to a service. So that's essentially what Lambda is going to do. All it is kind of an interface where it goes out and can get data. It can do all kinds of things. You can execute some code that goes and does something and then does something else. Any questions on what Lambda is doing here?
What's the max duration that a Lambda can run?
The file size can't be over,
I'm asking about the time.
Oh,
Lambdas can't run indefinitely.
yeah, 5 minutes. You can have time. You would have to have timeout handling on the other side in order to go and justify that, or not justify that, but handle that essentially. Amazon isn't going to. Amazon has this idea or this philosophy, I should say, that they're going to allow you to do kind of whatever you want, and they're going to put the onus on you to go make sure you have the proper error handling for things like timeouts or like if you have like a queue, they want to make sure that you're handling stuff in like SQS to make sure that comes back okay and that you're handling all those transactions. They really put a lot of that on you as the developer, not because they want to be mean about it or they couldn't do it themselves. It's just that it makes it a tighter box. And they want for the latest and greatest stuff that keeps coming out, they want to kind of have that idea of you can handle it, because then that allows you to kind of do funkier things and let you design your application where they're not telling you you must fit in this box and here is how we handle timeouts or things like that. So it kind of gives you more ability to control your own world, and they want you to do that. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why there isn't a lot of guardrails around some of these things, but they do bake in a couple little bits and pieces here and there. Zenit?
Might go past 5 minutes, you should look into step functions.
Yep.
Step functions is the big one.
Or you could even break out otherwise you can probably break out your lambdas into other lambdas if you wanted to. If it depends on why you're timing out, like if it's just a lot of data, a lot of processing, sometimes you can even break it out into multiple lambdas, or you can find ways, like you mentioned, like you can find other paths around it.
You can afford it to work and stuff, but
Yeah.
sometimes you just reach a point where like the step functions are better, or what are they called?
Step functions.
Or just like some sort of event-driven architecture where something will kick off like an SNS to kick, the next lambda.
Yep, to have a queue. I mean, there's all kinds of solutions. The one thing about AWS, and the thing that I struggled with probably more than anything when I first started, is there are no defined necessarily patterns for what's the best approach. Every situation, every application, everything that you're going to build in AWS, 9 times out of 10 is going to be something that's just different. And you're going to have different ways to handle different situations, and there's no design patterns, and to get into that mindset of that there are kind of is a little bit of a trap, because then you start thinking, oh, well, this is how you tackle that, but every problem could be unique and could be solved in unique ways, and they keep putting out services that deprecate old stuff. Like the fact that we have Lambda now, like if people aren't, the adoption rate is starting to actually get some legs behind it, but if you just went into cryostasis for 2 years, you could be still working on a design pattern that doesn't even leverage this, and then you're wasting a lot of money by spinning up maybe EC2 instances that you don't need, or all kinds of other stuff. So that's.
We've started moving a bunch of stuff that used to be cron jobs or
Yep.
or like Jenkins pipelines that would do things. We're moving a ton of that into lambdas just because we don't have to maintain those instances.
Yep. It makes it.
We're not paying for them 24/7.
Right.
We only need them 4 times a day.
Right, to run a couple jobs. And that's why Lambda is so powerful, because you don't need to have a whole server behind it that you're paying for to run a bunch of stuff, to your point, that might just be a simple cron job that runs every hour. It's very inefficient financially to be setting things up that way anymore, and you could really be leveraging Lambda to get stuff done. Any other questions around Lambda?
Yeah, one question.
Yeah.
So like if you're doing a lot of configuration for the management tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way to export that, for example, if you want to import it into a different account, or if it was originally created by an employee who, for example, deleted all of it? So is there a way to export all of the configuration that you do?
Through IAM? Yeah, you can. All those policies, you can go look at all those policies and export that data, if that's what you're talking about, like for roles and stuff like that in IAM.
Okay.
Yeah, there are ways to do that, and I can show you afterwards if you're still interested, but it's not that difficult of a process.
Okay.
Cool. There was a question over there?
Yeah, I was going to
No
kind of
worries.
ask the question. There's got to be a penalty for a cold boot here, right?
For what?
You don't have a server that's already running to handle this request.
Mm-hmm.
It has got to spin this runtime up. There has to be a penalty. True? It can't be free.
It's got hot servers already running, so you just plug.
Yeah, you're just plugging in.
Your very first invocation, but I mean, he's right. It'll have hot servers running. You'll see it if you run this thing.
Yeah.
The execution times go down radically.
Yeah, so essentially it becomes warm at that point, and AWS will keep it for forgotten amount of time. But if you keep invoking that Lambda like every X amount of times, then it'll continue to keep it warm. And even some people, just to reduce latency, will just have things that go out there, and every 5 minutes, it's just whether or not it's used or not, they'll just be invoking their Lambdas to keep them in warm. So that way they get a better performance out of it.
Yeah, when you think of it as being behind a load balancer, right? If you fall over and you have to start up a new server, there's a good time to it. But it's in general an amortizes.
Right. Because otherwise it's got to be cold, and then they have to get it in there, and they have to plug it in essentially into their system. But then once it's in there, it stays essentially in their memory for X amount of time until it goes away.
You only pay for the actual invocation.
Correct.
So the spin up and the spin down is not being charged to you. So if you have a Lambda, as Adam was saying, it's just going and keeping it warm, but it executes in, a small amount of time, and it's not a huge cost to you or your company.
Yep.
On that same topic, can you comment on do you know what the architecture is underneath in Amazon? Is it
Yes, I do.
containers, or is it EC2? What's being bootstrapped to support a Lambda functionality?
I'm trying to remember exactly what it is. It's not necessarily an EC2. We can talk about
Like a Linux container or something like that.
kind of. I forgot exactly what it is under the hood. I can look it up for you and get back to you though, because I know this. It's like it's in my memory. I just can't remember it right now. I was even talking about it with someone on Monday. Sig was in the room. Maybe he'll remember. but yeah, I was literally talking about this with someone 3 days ago. But I can't remember for the life of me what it was. But essentially, yeah, they're just injecting it into whatever's running, and then they're just letting it execute on that. But I forgot exactly what the container is specifically.
They're running one of their own services.
Yeah, I just don't. Sometimes for a lot of things, the way that Amazon has their services, a lot of times they'll be to support how am I going to phrase this? So you'll have a service that comes out for Amazon. Let's say it's Poly, for example. There's now actually, when Poly came out, it was just like one thing. And then a year later, they said, well, instead of there being just Poly, we're going to give you access to we're going to make 3 new services, essentially what they used to build Poly, but now they've just made it available to everybody. I can't remember what those 3 are, but there are 3. And essentially those 3 come together, made Poly. It's the Alexa skill had Poly as one of their services, and then they opened up Poly as a service, but they originally built it for Alexa skill, for example. And so a lot of times things that are under the hood that they're kind of trying to develop, they'll break them out later because they're not ready for mainstream yet, but they do have a purpose inside of their skills that they do want to release. So I don't remember what's in there. I don't think it's an actually released thing, but I don't remember specifically. But let me get back to you on that. So cool. All right. Any other questions on Lambda or anything else? We're getting there, I promise. All right. So we have this Lambda created. So the last bit that we're going to be doing is actually going into API Gateway. So now we have our Lambda that's talking to Dynamo. We're going to go in now and create our API Gateway, which is going to allow a RESTful call to invoke our Lambda. So we are going to get started. Thanks, API Gateway. That's cool. I don't need that. Yeah, I don't know. Why did they give me this by default? Oh, Amazon. So we're going to make a new API, not their example API for some reason. And we're going to call this API, and this is going to be Denver Modern Web. And we're going to call it APIs for Denver Modern Web. And we're going to create this API. So essentially now this is going to be our collection of all our services that we're going to create. We're only going to create one today just because all we want to do is use our Lambda to get those hosts and populate them on our screen. So we are in resources, and this is where we're going to start defining all of our calls. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to create a method. We're going to call it get because we're running a get function. Get is going to invoke a Lambda because that's what we've already coded up. It's going to be in US East 1 because that's where we created our Lambda. And if we type in our Lambda, yeah, it is. See, it even knows. If you just start typing, it'll actually, Amazon's really good about letting you just drop down, select what comes in there. I couldn't even remember it off the top of my head right now. I started writing Lambda, but it was called get host. That's what we called it. So it found it, which is awesome. So we'll go into here and we'll click save. And now I could have gone into IAM and set up some profiles. I'm actually kind of cheating right now. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow this function be able to access Lambda. I didn't go through IAM, but you could. There's lots of ways to actually set that up in here. But for the sake of time in this demo, they prompt you to be like, you probably wanted this, right? Then I go, thanks, Amazon. And I click OK. And that'll actually add those permissions that I need for API Gateway to talk to Lambda. So we're done. You go in here to test, and you can see all your structure here of how it's going out, and then it's going to get that Lambda, and the Lambda is going to return all your stuff back. And that's awesome. So we can go to test, and we can just make sure that it's working correctly. We can go to test, and we can see this is the same kind of test function that we got out of Lambda when we ran that Lambda test. Same thing here. We're hooked in, which is awesome. So we're all set. But there's a couple things we need to do first before we can actually deploy this. And that's really setting up cores. So I don't know how familiar the group is with cores. Essentially, this is what allows something from a different domain to actually invoke your API call. So typically you'll have this live on the same domain. All your APIs live on the same domain. If we had the right DNS hosting set up, I wouldn't even have to enable this because they'd all be on the same domain. But because our site is statically hosted in S3 and is going to have a different base than what we're going to publish this as, we have to enable cores. And we could whitelist our specific domain, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to say star is awesome. Let's do star. So this will allow essentially anything to go in here. You're just going to click yes, replace existing values, and that set us up. So now this core is enabled. So all the calls that are going to be inside of what we're going to create are going to be able to be accessible from anywhere. So now we have our get, which is great, but now we actually got to tie it to actually something to be invoked. And that's where we're going to go to deploy API. And we're going to set up a new stage. And stage is essentially what it's going to be called to actually invoke it. So we're going to call it hosts. And this is going to be essentially a get call to hosts. So we could also do a post in here. You can do a delete in here if we were getting fancy. And you could all have it be within the space of hosts. But then if you wanted a new API, you would go in and create a new resource and then set it up to point to, I don't know, members, let's say. And members might be a whole nother API that you could assign get, posts, and all those things too. So this is going to be and our description is our first API deployment of hosts. And I'm going to hit deploy. All right, we're here. This is our URL. We can make a RESTful call to this, and it's going to go, and it's going to retrieve that string. Again, we could have fancied this up and made it and kind of gotten rid of some of the gobbledygook that's around this, and you would have done that probably in the Lambda layer to make sure that it actually cleaned up your data for you, so that way when it returned, maybe we would have only returned this. But I'm going to be, for the sake of time, I didn't go in and write that. But that could be a good improvement that we should do eventually. So we have this host. We have it actually set up, and it's returning data. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to update our S3 file that we had all the way at the beginning in here. And I'm going to go in and open up our HTML file that I had at the very beginning. No, thank you. No, thank you. And we'll just paste that guy in here just so that way we have it. I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to go in and go new window, recent, final, and I wrote some extra code to go in and get this guy up and moving. So we'll go in here, replace this. Essentially, we've added another H2 field with a span tag. I've added some beautiful jQuery in here because I'm not writing native Ajax handlers because no thank you. So we'll go in here and we'll replace it in here. And as I wanted to make this meme, I don't always use jQuery, but when I do, it's for prototypes and demos. Don't use jQuery anymore. There's lots of better options out there. That's the front-end developer and me being like, no, don't use this. So just be aware. But yeah, for our purposes here for this demo, we're going to go out and we're going to make this call. We're going to say get JSON, so it's going to be a get call. That's going to go out and make an Ajax call. It's going to go invoke our new service that we just we just post it in here. And then when everything is ready with jQuery and it has the data, it's going to tell this span tag up here to take that data, which is going to be the first item, which is my name, the first host name, and it's going to replace with the inside HTML. So it will eventually, it'll look like that when the call is done. But we don't want that for right now. So we'll put that here. We'll go back to S3. We could upload, add file, our new HTML file, and hit upload. We can see our timestamp change. I'm 5 minutes beyond probably where I wanted to be, but we still kind of got there in time, so it's okay. And if we go back to over here where it says Denver Modern Web, and we refresh, we can see that it goes out there. Yeah, we did it. Yep, and just so make sure that you can actually see it actually go out, is going out. It's called host, so like when you see the actual services come back, we called it host, it goes out, and there's all my pretty data that I had. So, all right. Questions on that part of things with API Gateway? I know that was quite a bit, and I may have rushed through it a little bit, but does that make sense, or any questions on API Gateway?
Where did you define the host endpoint?
Here, when I did stages.
Okay. Can that be a regular expression?
What do you mean a regular expression?
You know, we want to take a character set without any alphanumeric values, but we don't allow.
I mean, then how would you know what to call for your RESTful service? Or I guess you want a RESTful service that has a dynamic piece to it?
Yes, and my follow-on question was going to be, can we get this value within the Lambda or inside the Lambda itself?
This value inside of Lambda?
Yeah, the path.
Yes, you can get that inside of Lambda in order to go and then make your subsequent calls. Because you can actually pass data through here. I mean, we just did a get, but if you were going to do like a post, for example, you can go and you would pass data from here through into Lambda, and you can even do that even through like the URL structure if you want. Like if you even wanted a get that had data associated with it, like query parameters, you can pass those things through and then do stuff with it on the other side. So there's lots of actually, I have not been limited by this in any way. So I can imagine, I don't know the exact solution that you would do if it was the beginning of it. Like if you wanted it to start with a star of something to go invoke, because I don't really know how that would work. I'd have to think about it. But if you wanted it to be like hosts something, then you can do that. So, cool. Any other questions? All right.
Yes.
Sure.
Somebody else is asking me questions right now. It's kind of a bit of a tangent, but would you recommend using Visual Studio Code over WebStar?
I use Visual Studio Code for everything, so yes. That's fine. That is a tangent, but that's okay. I like Visual Studio Code. I was a convert from. I used to use Sublime Text before that, and this is better Sublime Text. So, any other questions about anything we covered today? We covered a lot. I know the one thing I will say is we covered a lot today with AWS. We covered 5 services. If this is all new to you, then yeah, it's a lot to go through. But yep.
You said you had started maybe about a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
What was the thing that for someone who's starting out you would recommend that they should know? Like, what was your biggest tripping point?
The biggest tripping point that I had, the thing that really got me, IAM. Like when we were going in and setting all those roles and permissions, that's by far one of the more difficult concepts to kind of, it's like one of those, it's like a bell curve almost, if you will. It's like you start out and you feel like you know nothing, and then you gotta get to this middle ground of your like where I feel like I'm at right now, where like, I know how all these things work. And then you get on a real project, which has like, where it can just be like, there's so many roles, there's so many users, and how do you manage all this? And the nested, well, you're in a group, but you have a role, and like, it can get really hairy really quick if it's not maintained and set up properly. So I think IAM is by far, because nothing happens without IAM. All your services, nothing talks to anything without IAM. So if you messed up IAM, you kind of messed yourself up for the whole project. And so it's one of the things where the learning curve can be like kind of a little tough to kind of get the initial concept of what are all these things, even like, well, what's a user versus a group versus a role versus a permission. And getting that base knowledge takes a minute, but then it didn't like S3, oh, I dumped something in S3, got it, S3. But then like kind of when you get to that, like then there's that like that next level moment of IAM where you go, oh. So I think that would probably be the biggest thing that's tripped me up when I've been learning this. Yep.
Given the statement you just made, do you think that Amazon nailed IAM, or are we dealing with one of their kind of early stage things? And they did
I think it goes back to their overall philosophy of they're not responsible for how you set up your system. Could there be more guardrails in place and more things that you could do? There's a lot they can do, but again, they restrict you. They'd be restricting you, and it's
Or hierarchical groups.
hierarchical groups, meaning that you can be a group inside of a group.
Yes.
Yes, pretty sure. I might have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. I've never actually had to. I haven't had to do that yet. Normally, I've had just groups and then just given them the right access and the right roles, as opposed to having groups inside of subgroups. But I believe you can.
I think it's more like you attach policies to either groups or roles, and you, like they separate out by policy, and you attach and say, well, you need this and need this and need this.
That's how I've set it up.
They flatten it out.
Yeah, that's how that describes how I've done it. I feel like you can do groups inside of groups, but I've just never done it before.
Yeah. I mean, to me, where I am gets messy is like with the older services like S3, where S3 you can apply bucket policies, and you can apply separate IAM policies, and that's
Yep.
that interplay for me messes it up really.
Yeah, it can get pretty hairy when you're trying to maintain your access and trying to understand all of that. So yeah, back to your original question, IAM is probably the hardest thing that I've had to do when learning stuff. And we didn't cover it today, but VPC is a lot of fun too. So, yep.
And plus,
Nope.
well, plus IAM interplays with like third-party authentication too. But anyway, sorry.
Cool. Yep.
Real quick, so the idea of doing, I love the idea of doing a flat website on MS3.
Yep.
Do you have any personal recommendations from that sort of HT access approach, where obviously you leave the bucket wide open, but what services do you employ to sort of lock down? Are you using the actual service on the web traffic coming in as far as restrictions? How do you personally like to set up your security?
For security, I mean, normally a lot of the security layer I'll put into the API and making sure that like if your auth system based into it. I'm assuming you're talking about like auth or something else. I'm not.
Well, I guess it'd be two different levels. So auth would be a good one, but let's just say you have this nice wide open public site.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a range of IP addresses that all of a sudden I need to start restricting. So how would you
So
in the system go about it?
inside your bucket, you can restrict IP ranges if you want as a part of the permissions. So we allowed all, like if we went back to your bucket permissions,
Is that the level you like to apply that at?
you could. I mean, it depends. I haven't had too much. So a lot of the times I'll have my sites be pretty open, and then I'll use things like auth gates and then API level restrictions based on authentication and other things, and ranges to be able to invoke certain APIs like your cores issue, all the core stuff that we talked about. That's typically where I'll keep a lot of that logic. Typically, I won't actually do much with the bucket itself because at that point you're restricting whole domains to only letting certain people access in certain ranges, and you can set that up at that level. That's typically where I've set that up. But I don't have a ton of experience with entire static websites at that level of restriction. Like normally, a lot of the portals and things that I've built are consumer facing, and not behind, let's say, like a corporate block of some sort, like an intranet.
Bucket with hosting on there, right? As opposed to a static site. And I'm moving away from EC2 because of cost.
Right.
It's prohibitive.
Yep.
So I'm trying to figure out some better ways that I can.
Yeah. If you have,
Use the same sort of
if you,
policies I employ on my EC2 buckets, but across more services.
yeah. So afterwards, if you want to come grab me and we can talk a little bit about it, it sounds like you have a very specific scenario that you're trying to solve for. So if you want to come grab me afterwards, then maybe that'll make it a little bit more clear to what you're trying to solve. But at the same time, I have to say I've never actually done like an intranet-based, like only people on this corporate network or that are in or on this VPN can access this static, like the entirety of it. Normally, a lot of things that I work on are public-facing or don't need that level of security. Cool. All right. Any other questions on anything AWS? Yes.
So when you were going into your journey for the last year, did you guys already decide on AWS, or was that part of a decision?
So Slalom, as a company, has kind of gone and said we have a partnership with AWS, and so a lot of our folks here are AWS certified or getting AWS certified, and that's kind of I'll call it the default, but that doesn't mean we still have clients that want GCP and Azure and all that stuff that's kind of out there. So we're not limited in that. And ultimately, kind of when all these services first came out, you had AWS and you had Google and you had Azure. Let's just call those ones for now. There are others, but at first, everybody said, okay, we're going to all have maybe we're 50% unique. Each one of those, if you imagine it being kind of like a Venn diagram, they were all they kind of overlapped by about 50% with and then they had another 50% that was very new to them. But then they all kind of looked at each other and went, oh, I need that because my customers are going to want that, and Amazon just rolled it out. So I'm going to basically make the same service, but I'm going to call it Google blah, blah, blah instead of Amazon blah, 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 and we're going to build it into our ecosystem. And this kind of back and forth has been going on between the major players in the market for a long time, where now it's maybe let's call it 50%, 50%. Now it's only maybe 10% of what's out there is very unique to AWS or unique to Google. And once you understand the core of one of these, it doesn't take a lot to understand the core of all the others because they all kind of played off each other, and there's only a very small margin of things that are unique to each platform at this point, I would say. We're kind of coming to this point where it's the more fringe services. It's like the Polys of the world when that comes out, or they have the new Translate service. It's things like that they're trying to be unique, and each other kind of have those fringes until they all copy each other, and then that gets added to the bigger bucket of what they all support. So here, primarily AWS is what we focus on, but that doesn't mean it's exclusive. It's also one of those things where we have the mentality that once you have a very core understanding of one of them, it doesn't take a lot to kind of get quickly ramped up on something else if you were going to a client or someone that wanted one of the others.
So are there abstractions people are using so they can migrate code between AWS and GCP and Azure?
Yeah, there's some. Yeah. There's a lot of equivalents, and you can find the right mappings, and there's whole tutorials and things it always depends. Well, you're going from blank to blank, and there's there's nowhere in here is there a button that says export to Google Cloud Platform. So
I can see abstractions being a big
yeah, and that can be something that's out there. A lot of the times, though, I find that once someone has gone into an ecosystem, there has to be a pretty big reason for them to go to a different ecosystem. So that's just something to be aware of. And even then, if you set up it's hard to have them talk to each other, but at the same time, there are ways. Cool. All right. Anything else on AWS or even myself or any other questions you might have?
I'll ask one final one.
Okay.
What about local development? Are there tools that people are using to do development locally? Can you emulate S3 and DynamoDB locally? Or
No.
do you always have to
You have to talk to it, in my experience.
There's similar plugins and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be what,
It's not like ubiquitous. It's not like you can't pull down the entire
right.
ecosystem.
That,
It's
yes.
like S3 mocks. There's for Lambda, AWS has, I can't even think what it's called. They do have a mock framework for Lambda where you can stand stuff up and pretend that all the resources are there.
Right.
I saw the tools called LocalStack, but I don't know if it's what
I don't know.
its maturity level is. Or
In my experience, there's nothing that's going to compare to actually talking to the services. To their points, you can definitely find things out there that will try to mock it to the best of its ability. But at the end of the day, I still recommend that you point to some kind of real thing if you can. I mean, if you're afraid of security or something and you don't want it to go anywhere, the reason why these things exist is also because AWS or whatever cloud platform you want, they want you to pay for their services. They want you to be in there. So a lot of times they make it so that way you have to access them in order to get the full functionality. And there are things that try to come close and help you mock and do other stuff, and there's tools out there, but realistically, sometimes it's best just to talk to the things. And if you're just testing and trying stuff out, again, the free tier, they give you so much for the free tier that if you're just testing things and just proving out concepts, you can do them at small scale and have it cost you, pennies, and then you have confidence going into your larger scale applications when you have lots of users and lots of data that it's going to work. And the way I always look at it is, if your business is successful, in order to invoke a million Lambda calls and all these things, like you're probably making money off of whatever you put out there anyway to cover whatever cost you're spending in AWS if you're hitting the benchmarks beyond their free tier. I know lots of people that have very successful web applications that are out there that make them good amounts of money for services, e-commerce, and all kinds of stuff like that, that they pay almost nothing in hosting compared to what they would have had to set up for infrastructure otherwise, just because of how much, like, just how A, how cheap stuff is, and B, how much AWS just gives you for free. Like they have their whole call of Lambda stacks, and like I have a friend that's like, yeah, we finally had to pay, like after 2 years, like we finally hit our Lambda quota and we started having to pay $1 a month, and it was just like it's just crazy to think about. So until you've kind of hit those levels, like it probably is just best to go with the actual service if cost is your concern. If you have security reasons, but then even then it's as secure or insecure as you make it inside of your policies.
I don't know where you're coming from, but as a developer, it's like you just don't want to have to connect to this stuff because it makes it fragile. And that's like, from a testing perspective, I want to run this thing 1,000 times, and I don't even really care what it costs, but it just makes it fragile. And,
fragile in what way?
well, like you have to be connected to a network, and you have to have the right credentials attached. And like if you're running inside, this doesn't apply. Like a thing we've run into is we've got somebody developing a thing that runs inside of EC2, and it's like normally you would just attach it all over the EC2 and everything would just work. Well, you can't do that in your local machine because your
Right.
machine doesn't adopt their role. So that's like, okay, so now we have to have one authentication mechanism for when you're running on a dev box, and one authentication, or essentially ignore authentication when you're running on EC2. And so it's like you've got these environmental differences that you just want to get rid of.
I see.
And that's kind of what, I would like for some of this stuff. Is, again, this is why we do a Docker container.
Right. And Docker's great for that.
Docker container where you can just come up and say, yes, I'm this guy and I can do.
Yeah, and you can just take that Docker container and just be like, all right, here you go, and just ship it over there. And that's another way to get around a lot of this stuff too, for deployments and stuff like that. It's just baking everything inside of Docker.
Right. Yeah,
So it's a little outside the scope of this talk, but yeah.
Right, yeah, but I mean, some of this like Lambda, I mean, they do have ways you can, Amazon itself has an official thing you can mock it out. S3, there are like unofficial ways you can mock it out.
Yep.
But yeah, you're kind of on your own. There's no like overarching Amazon thing that this is how you do it.
Yeah, I was thinking about local development, right? You make a change to a Lambda. Using the cloud services, you obviously have to deploy that. You guys were talking earlier that servers are spun up and they're worn. Well, you've got to replace those, right? There's got to be a deployment cost there where I have a typo and I want to fix it real quick and I want to test it. I don't want to have to deploy it.
They, so when we tested, so I remember when we were in Lambda before you could hit test, that costs you nothing.
Okay.
It's only when it's actually being invoked by something that's real. Test will never cost you money.
And is Lambda one of those services that provide you the free whatever?
You get 1 million of them a month.
Okay, is that limited for 12 months or is that?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think so. Here, we can, you know what? There's a lot. I have one thing in here. I had this bookmarked in case it came up, and it absolutely came up. So yeah, it's 1 million compute server that runs on the cloud. So this is a part of this is all the free tier. Then below, non-expiring. Yeah, you get 1 million still per month, even after the expiration. Yeah, so that's the other reason why I was saying, like, yeah, even after the free tier expires, there's a lot of stuff in here. Like, this is all the stuff that they offer for you that you can still do. But don't use SES. It's terrible. It's really bad.
I mean, it's good, but the thing is, sometimes your development cycle, because then you're uploading something to Lambda, and it's just like, as a developer, I just want to run stuff and have it, spin
Right, you just want to be able to go in and knock it out. I get it.
I think that's where this is coming from. It's just like, and yeah, I think the answer is like, some of it's out there and some of it's not, and you just kind of have to step around those landmines. And I go through this with some of our stuff. It's like, there's no effective way to test it. And we have, 3 tiers. We've got development and QA, production at where I work, and it's still like, it might take me 5 minutes to, just build something, upload it, and do this stuff, and then it's like, it just kind of slows you down.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else? All right. Great. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. I was going to say we're going to be hanging out here for a little bit. So there's pizza and beer if you guys want to hang out for a little bit. If you want to ask me. Oh, there's no more pizza. Oh, man. I should have ordered more pizza. I thought 7 would be. There's beer. There's beer. And we have some. I can put out some chips if anyone's hungry. Just come grab me. And, yeah, and come ask me questions. I'll be hanging out here for another hour or so until everybody goes. So great. Thanks so much.